Okay. So I think
So
you
you
need
have
to
to say continue, right?
yeah, you have to say continue to have it
Yeah,
start.
I do.
Everybody. So it's so nice to see all of you. This is just going to be a casual conversation. And the reason I want to do this is because we're all mentors at Lesley. We're teaching the low residency program. But I don't think we get to talk so much about being writers ourselves. So I thought that we would do this just to talk about our own writing, our own craft, and just throw out some ideas. So I thought that I would throw out a couple of ideas or a couple of questions, and feel free to take either one, or if you don't like one, you can answer the other one, or you don't have to answer anything, but these are just for conversation starters. So, so the first question is, was there a definitive moment in your youth when you became a writer? Was there a moment when something went click and you decided, I'm a writer, I'm a fiction writer, I'm a nonfiction writer, or anything? Was there a moment like that, or was it a progression of events? And also, when you look back at that from today, what do you see as different in the way you saw yourself, or the way you saw your craft, or the way you thought you would be, and the way you look at your writing today?
I thought I would be rich.
Yeah.
Yes. And the other question is there a kind of injustice or yearning at the core of your writing that drives your writing? Is there something like that, a need that sort of comes through you as a person that reflects in your writing? For me, it's because I'm dual national, because I was born in this country, I was raised in Turkey. So I was really divided between two cultures, two religions, two languages. So there's always been that division, cultural division. And I feel like much of my writing is about trying to bring those two together. So really build a bridge between cultures. So my play Peripalas is really about that, about Western. There's a Western part of the story and the Turkish part of the story, and those two stories sort of bridge through each other and struggle to get together, really. So I feel like that's the injustice, I should say, that there's this gap between cultures that drives much of my writing. And obviously nowadays I feel really disheartened, because it feels, at one point when I first started writing, it felt like it was coming together, and now it's like diverging. But anyway, I think my play still represents that. So I think that I like it that when people see it, people think about those issues. So that's my answer to that question.
Sinan, do you want to call on us, or do you just want us to?
No, you can go. Why don't you start, Hester?
You should start, Hester. You were nodding your head the
All
most.
right, I was nodding my head. I do remember a very, very particular moment. I think I was probably about 13 or 14. So a big reader of both Judith Krantz and Charles Dickens, and fairly disaffected, like most 13 or 14-year-olds. And my mother gave me a copy of the New Yorker, and she said, "Read this story." And I'd never read any fiction I'd never read any short fiction in the New Yorker. And I don't remember the story, and I don't remember what it was about, but I remember a particular image where the narrator is in a car, and she looks out onto an empty parking lot, and she sees the sort of sparkles in the black asphalt. And it provokes in her this feeling of sort of longing. And I remember thinking, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen, that you can provoke or invoke a feeling from a description of something that's, entirely mundane. And so I think I saw then what the right words could do. And that's always been sort of what I'm after, is to try to invoke some sort of feeling from the right description.
That's amazing that you at 13 fell for craft like that.
Yeah, I can remember exactly where I was when I read the story.
Where were you?
Yeah, it really was sort of life-changing. But then, I refused to pick up a pen or a pencil for the next probably 8 years. So 10 years.
Because?
It took a while. Well, having two parents as writers makes it a little bit difficult. A little bit like going into the family business. You kind of have to be something of a masochist, I think, to do that. So I was content at that point to really just read and to start reading for moments like that.
Mm.
Mm.
I really loved, the stories that my mother told me. So I kind of grew up on this kind of like diet of all these fairy tales, like the Brothers Grimm, and also like the Peach Boy, which is like a Japanese fairy tale. And the thing I always wanted to know, though, was the irrelevant. David, you've written about the boys who turned into ravens, but one of my favorite stories was like the boys being turned into swans, knitting princess story.
Right.
And what I always wanted to know was the youngest boy. I mean, she ran out of time, so his sweater didn't have a sleeve, so he still had a wing, after he was turning into a human being. And that's what I wanted to know. I mean, how did he get dressed after, like in the princess costume? And did he feel like that was a good thing or a bad thing that he had a wing? So that always interested me. But, but really I too wanted to be a writer because I liked being a reader. I mean, if I could just have been a reader for the rest of my life, I might even have been happy. But I think also the greatest injustice, mine is totally trivial, was that I was not 2 inches taller. When I became a teenager, had I been 2 inches taller, I would have been a real something on the basketball court. I was a good player, but I was too small, even in Japan. And that made me think, okay, I mean, not that I would have become a professional athlete, but that made me turn to like running and writing, which to me are really related. I mean, because even a small person could do those things. And also, had I been 2 inches taller, I think people would have noticed me more. I can just go under the radar because I'm short and plain and nobody sees me. And I like being a spy. And I think that also kind of triggered wanting to be a writer, to listen to conversations, observe people, and kind of tucked it away. And sometimes it's in fiction, other times it's in nonfiction, but stuff I observe, I think, okay, I'm gonna put that in my writing sometime.
Love that. So, but is 2 inches being 2 inches taller, is that injustice driving your writing, or is that really why you became a writer? Or is it?
I think it's why I became a writer, and it gives me this cover, or at least a feeling that I'm not so noticeable, which I really like. Like I don't mind giving a reading, but even then I feel like it's a piece, not about me, and I think it kind of made me into the kind of person who wanted to be a writer, as opposed to say like a public speaker or, whatever. I mean, I'm 5'2". Had I been 5'4", I would have been like a, taller person. I'm not talking about being really, really tall.
Well, to me, you're very tall.
Talking about not.
You wouldn't have known you,
person.
so it's a good thing that you're not.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, all my life I've been dismissed as, oh, you're so tiny, that sort of thing. And I got used to that. That means nobody has to see me. Even like in Wisconsin, where people stared at me, being small actually meant that you could kind of be unnoticed even as being stared at. That was interesting.
Mhm.
I never thought of you as tiny or even small.
That's good. I'm glad. Yeah.
Me neither. But I like that you guys are short, Jane and Kyoko, because it makes me in nonfiction tall.
You are tall.
Really tall. David, you were going to say something.
Yeah, sorry.
I don't know what I was going to say. I think there is not a moment when I ever decided, I'm going to be a writer. What I really wanted to do was be an opera singer. And I studied at New England Conservatory. And sadly, I was late in in my vocal education, I guess I would say. And, you know, sadly, what I learned is what the world does not need. I didn't learn this, I decided myself. What the world does not need is one more mediocre tenor, because it's just torture. But I still had this desire to kind of give something of myself, I guess. I know that sounds kind of corny. And I did not grow up in a literary household by any means. My dad might have finished the 8th grade, and my mother married him. She would have been a valedictorian for class if she had finished high school, but she quit high school and married him. So, you know, I didn't, unlike Hester, where there were a lot of books and a lot of writing going on. That was not my case. But what I did have was a lot of really rich, a lot of rich oral language. My dad, I never heard my dad say thank you. He always said, much obliged.
Oh.
And my grandmother referred to umbrellas as bumbershoots still. And even my mother, you know, they did not speak standard English, but, you know, I remember calling my mom when she was in her 80s, and I said, Mom, how are you? And she said, oh, David, I'm as slow as Job's turkey. So I grew up with this, a lot of language around me, and then I was raised as a Baptist, which only took me millions of dollars and millions of hours on the couch to get over. But what it did give me was another kind of very rich linguistic experience. Those very seductive calls to the altar and the language of both the language of the King James Bible, which I heard a lot of, but also the ministers thing. And so I think those began to combine with when, you know, I really didn't start writing until I was 50. So I feel like I'm becoming a writer every time I sit down to work, because every new work is different. Every work requires something. I've never had a writing class. So I still many times feel like I'm walking into a dark room and trying not to trip over the furniture. But, you know, life is mysterious. It's beautiful. It's strange. And, you know, that if I started talking about injustices, my personal injustices,
Well, you know
it
what?
would be
You were
here
talking,
forever.
something occurred to me to ask you really specifically. Is there something about the world that your writing wants to fix?
Well, this is very personal. I would just say this. You know, my own childhood, as I think most of you know, was not a happy one. You know, I think I'm always trying to fix that.
Okay.
Through my work, you know, not consciously, but you know, I want the world to be happier than it is. So that, I guess that's, you know, that's not so highfalutin, and really I am so lowfalutin. Give me a hot dog and a cheap beer and I'm happy. But I guess really in many ways that is what I'm after. And I'm also, just as I said before, I'm very interested in the mystery of where it comes from and how one relates to one's inner self through that process of writing. Okay, that's enough of that.
Thank you. That's great.
Well, I can, I really, as a teenager, a young girl, I used to write and I liked to read. I didn't have a particularly literary household. We had some books in the family, but you know, my father was a farmer. He wasn't much of a reader. And I kind of bumbled along after college, and I was living on Nantucket trying to write, but not knowing how, not knowing any writers, not knowing how to become a writer. And then about in my mid-20s, I got sick of myself trying to be a writer. And so I said, I sat myself down and I said, okay, this is going to go one of two ways. I'm either going to do this or I'm going to give it up and actually try to make a living some other way. So I gave this is very funny. I gave myself a year and I called it the year of the poet, where I would put poetry first. You know, I took a job in a restaurant that started late in the morning so I could have these mornings free to write. And I said, and I started reading contemporary poetry because I was writing poetry at the time. So I said, I'll just give myself a year and see where it takes me. And if at the end of that year, I'll just make an assessment. So I did that. And I actually stuck to writing and I was doing all this reading. And at the end of the year, I had a pile of poems, you know, in this little kitchen table in Squam on Nantucket. And I gave myself another year. And then I just kept giving myself.
Oh, good.
So that's kind of how I became a writer, I guess, you know. And and then I you know, and I kept it was just a lot of following my nose. I realized, you know, I said to myself one day after about 3 years of this, if I stay on Nantucket, I'll never grow in the way I need to become a writer, because I just didn't have a writing community. You know, it was the mid 80s. There was no kind of internet or anything. So I came up to Cambridge. I moved to Cambridge and you know, joined a writing class and all that, and went to poetry readings at the Blacksmith House and all that sort of thing. And so that it just sort of kept inching along from there. And, you know, it did take 15 years to publish my first book from that decision to be, you know, a writer. But there you go.
And
But
when did you get your MFA?
I got my MFA probably about 6 or 7 years after the year of the poet. So,
The year of the poet. I love
I
that.
love it.
Yeah. I think we all should now have bumper stickers that say "Put poetry first."
Yeah. Yeah.
I've been thinking about, you know, well, what underlies sort of that first book, Here and Nowhere Else, which was about returning to the family farm, and the one I'm writing now about single women. And I think it has to do, maybe very much like Kyoko, I think I'm interested in what isn't seen. You know, the farm, I was trying to record the farm before it disappeared. It was the last of the farm amidst suburbia. And I think that's the same impulse behind wanting to write about the homes of single women, which, you know, traditionally single women were invisible. So, so I guess that's the story, and I'm sticking to it. So.
You're still giving yourself a year.
I'm giving myself a year.
That's good.
I think this is a year of forgetting. So.
Yeah. This is the year we want to forget.
Oh, that's funny. Well, I'm going to weigh in with the most trite and classic and silly version of when I decided to become a writer. It's like you couldn't, you know, call Central Casting, ask a kid, when are you going to be a writer? Well, when did you decide to be a writer? And this would be the answer. Anybody guess what a girl would say? A girl,
How old were you?
especially a young
How old was
girl.
the girl? How old was the girl?
Girl was 8 years old.
Okay.
What would a girl be reading then?
Harriet the Spy.
I wish. That's
Or
a
The
little
Bear
cooler.
Goddess Me Margaret. Secret Garden.
Oh, I loved The Secret Garden. But
Anne of Green Gables.
Little Women.
Oh, Little Women.
Little Women.
Of course.
My mom read Little Women to me. It was funny because I thought, I think I could probably read this myself, but I wanted her to read it to me, so I kind of didn't let on that I could read it. And I remember sitting on the sofa after school every day, and she'd read some of Little Women. And, you know, there's that I assumed everybody identified with Jo, who wanted to be the writer. And my mom would ask me, you know, who do you identify with? And I'd always say Jo. And then I talked to friends. Everybody read Little Women. And it wasn't a given. It was other people wanted to be Amy or Meg or Beth. My partner wanted to be Beth. And I said, well, you know, Beth dies. But
Exactly.
still likes
Yeah,
to be
Beth dies.
But what I made an assumption that I was like Jo. And I think I didn't understand for years why I made the assumption. I think I don't know why, but I assumed I was going to be a writer, and I lived with that for a long time. But and after I made that assumption, I was too afraid, though, to become a creative writer. I became the easiest kind of writer I could. I became a freelance writer first. And it took me a long time, like David, it took me a long time to be able to call myself a creative writer, the kind of writing, to do the kind of writing I really respect in others and that I like to read. But at the time, when I look back, Jo was telling family stories. And just as you guys have said, Jane and Kyoko, she was telling them so they wouldn't disappear. And she was like the archivist of the family. In fact, I don't know if someone even says that in the book. And I look back and I had this kind of archaeological impulse as a kid that I would dig in my mom's garden. I dig in the space between the sidewalk and the street to see what was there before us. And I would tell people, well, I'm looking to see that we're not alone. Wasn't there something here before? And this is when I was a kid. And I think that same impulse applied to why I aligned with Jo. She was telling stories so they wouldn't be lost. And I think that's exactly what I do. And I think that's the answer, Sinan, as well, to your question about the greatest injustice that motivates your work. I would say it's time. The fact, it's time and mortality. I want to tell the stories before they're lost. And why I assume my story matters, that I don't know. That's the big mystery. And other people are perfectly content not to have their stories told. But to me, I have to catch it because the hours move by. And if I don't catch it, it will just be gone. So, and I think Jo was after that. And I made some instinctual connection.
I think that's such an interesting literary question that your mother asked you when you were a little kid, which you identify with.
Right.
It's not sort of an obvious question. I don't think it really sort of gets.
I never considered that it wasn't. But she said, I remember very well her saying, pausing and saying, who do you feel like you're like? And I said, Jo. And she said, I think you're like Jo too. And that was that.
Well, it's a question that really gets to the heart of what reading and writing is about for many people.
It's true.
Pam, what you were saying about mortality reminded me of Bill Lychek. For anybody who doesn't know who Bill is, he's a wonderful fiction writer. And we were talking about stuff like this, I guess. And I never will forget what he said, which was, well, there really only is one topic. And to me, that sort of said the whole thing for me right there.
It's true. That is so true. And I had not a discussion exactly like this, but Bill and I one day walked through the old burying ground. What is it in Harvard Square?
Uh-huh.
And the conversation was, don't you wish you knew their stories? And he and I were just obsessively wanting to know, who was this? Who was that? And it's that kind of both curiosity and desire to save before it's lost.
Yeah, I think in the big universal sense, I think what drives my stories and the great injustice is death, really.
Yeah.
Right.
Injustice,
Mortality.
like why,
I'm interested in the question about how your writing has changed or the focus of your change. And when I think back to that little anecdote about the parking lot, I think my writing and my focus has barely changed at all, which is a sort of a sense that the greatest injustice is a kind of existential loneliness. I know that sounds, as David would say, highfalutin, but it's really, it's really lowfalutin and just an attempt to connect really to other people, I think, which I also think is, at the end of the day, often lets us down, or is often difficult. It's what we're always striving for.
Only connect, right?
Right? Yeah, I'm forced to.
I will say, sometimes I envy that young girl during that winter in Squam way back, it's, I don't know, over 40 years ago, because there was nothing attached to her writing.
Yeah.
No obligation, there was no career, there was no grasping for anything other than to get the words on the page. And there was such an innocence about that, and I sometimes mourn the loss of that. And I have this idea in my head that in my old age I'll return to that. An old woman writing poems. I'm like,
but sometimes, when I write something short, I still have that though. I think of a book as a project that it is not so innocent. But if I'm just starting something and writing something short, I still have that. The first thing I wrote that I remember, I don't remember the details of it, but when I realized that I might be really good at writing was in 2nd grade. We all had to write essays about the school lunches, and all my friends wrote about how great school lunches were. I actually did not really care for school lunches. I was really interested in how the eating experience was nothing like what you would have at home. And I found it just so totally discombobulating. So I know, I don't remember all the details, but I did write about how the school lunch was a kind of a strange experience. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was trying to examine this totally mundane thing as not being what it should be. And in a way, I think that still does drive my writing, no matter what it is that I'm trying to describe. First of all, I am interested in the mundane, or the everyday, whether it's like a school lunch or living with my cats or whatever. And it's always slightly or maybe very disquieting. What people take for granted is actually very complicated. And I think that's what I'm still interested in. And I was not so sophisticatedly interested in that in the school lunch, but I knew my motivation had to do with not praising it, but really looking at it and talking about why is school lunch such a strange experience? And I won the contest.
Oh, great.
And received this little mechanical pencil. After that,
I read the first story I ever wrote, I think, was probably, I tried it in maybe 8th grade, so it was before this thing that I told you about. And it involved a sweet little seashore town that within the first page, everybody and everything got wiped out by a tsunami.
Mr. Kaplan's story already.
That sounds.
I realized that after the tsunami, there was nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And that's that is a feeling all the time I have in writing. That dynamic has not gone away. That's the struggle. How do you save the wave till the end?
Yeah.
Well, my first story I wrote when I was in high school, but it's not because I wanted to be a writer. It's because I wanted to get out of my town. And so I just thought, okay, I know how I'll do it. I'll write a story and I'll become a famous writer and I'll get rich like you, Pam. And so I wrote this story, horrible story, about an insurance salesman, a stripper, and a farmer getting caught in an elevator. And the elevator, got stuck.
Of course.
And so I sent it off to the New Yorker, a magazine, by the way, I had never read, but I knew that they published fiction. And so I waited, breathlessly for my self-addressed stamped envelope to come back, not realizing that would be the kiss of death if I saw that. But anyway, it did come back finally. And I was so excited because this was going to be my ticket out of this town where I was raised and away from my family, and I couldn't wait. And I was
Wait,
going
before
to show,
you finish, how
yeah,
old were you?
16.
Okay.
And I was going to show them, and I opened the letter, and it was ripped in half. there wasn't even a form letter. There wasn't even a little card. It was just ripped in half.
The simplest edit ever.
Yeah, right. But I got my own back because a few years ago, one of my books was reviewed very nicely in the New Yorker.
I
So,
There you go.
you know, persistence pays off. You gotta learn to deal with rejection.
That's funny. I just wanted to say something about what Jane said about having lost the innocence of the of your young self, young Jane writing on Nantucket. I totally get that, and I feel that all the time, except for the book I just wrote, the whales book. Anybody who knows me knows it's the whales book, not whales as in the sea animal, but the place. Everything I've done as a professional writer, as a published writer, let's call it, tends to be toward publication, tends to be on deadline. I have an idea of where it's going to go, or it's commissioned. This did not. And this book took 8 years to write, and it taught me patience. I've never had patience. I'm not a patient person. And yet something in this said, through all the agents who rejected it, all the times the 4 times I started over, I just took a deep breath and was patient and started again and again. And the cliche that I sometimes feel that I tell my students, that writing really is discovery. Like if you know what you're going to say before you write it, it's going to be dead on the page. It's why write if you know why you're writing, if you know everything about your topic. You have to discover something, and that's where your writing shines. And I set out to discover something in this book, and I do feel like that kind of innocence was still there in some way, because I didn't know the answers. And I sometimes wish I were still writing it. It was kind of sad to finish after all that time.
I think this idea of returning to your innocent self is certainly something that I think I deal with every single time I sit down to write. That the experienced voice here says, what are you doing? Like, this is, no one cares. This is stupid. It's not well written. Do something useful. And what I have to do is, take that voice of experience out and return to this person that you're talking about, Jane, the person who really doesn't, know the way the world receives or cares about your work.
Yeah.
And
but your craft tools have grown. So that's the perfect combination when you're in command of your craft tools more than you were when you were young.
Right.
But you can get back to that place of innocence.
Well, part of the reason, one of the things that I was thinking about, there's a Buddhist notion called beginner's mind. And that is that when you first start out as a writer or any kind of artist, you start innocently. You just sort of it vomits out of you. And then you go into this long process of learning how to be a writer. You learn the craft. And then when you do that, you actually lose that innocence. But then once you get to a certain place in your life, Jane, you can actually go back to that innocence. Once you're comfortable with the craft, once you
I'm never comfortable with the craft.
Yeah.
Right.
No
it does become second nature after a while. And at one point it does.
I'm not sure about that. I struggle now, maybe more than ever.
But your standards keep going up, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, or I'm so, I struggle sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph, every day, all the time. It's like it's true.
I think I think craft is a really, it can be such a trap in a certain way. I mean, you know, I think with many of our students, sometimes they're relying so heavily on craft. If only I can learn to show and not tell. If only I can learn that less is more. If only I can learn. And I think sometimes it really prevents people. I mean, so now when I'm teaching, I often say, it's really good you're learning this, but now forget about it. Forget everything you've learned and get to the heart of the thing. Because, you know, yes, we admire craft and we need it, but it's also kind of boring. In a certain, you know, it can make for really boring writing, I feel. Which is why in a MFA program, I often think sometimes, you know, sometimes in workshop, I think, oh my God, if Melville were here, I could hear someone saying, probably me, this is really good, but get rid of the whale. You know, because the best writing is so eccentric and so idiosyncratic and doesn't always follow the rules of craft.
Right. I mean, some of the books I love the most, the craft might be wobbly, but it's just the impulse and the heart are all there.
Right.
Very polished, admirable books. I just don't have any patience for anymore. It's kind of,
But I think more and more what draws me, you know, to actually sit down and write is really to have the sentences going. I mean, you know, it's like I love that part where the sentences are sounding right and the paragraphs are coming together. You know, I mean, that to me is like the pleasure of writing. And then all of a sudden I know how to step away or like pivot, you know, like where I'm kind of aware what I'm doing, but I am not sitting here thinking, what am I going to do here? I am going to step away and provide a different perspective. Yeah. Somehow it just happens when you're doing it. You think, God, I'm kind of hitting a wall here. Oh, you know, I have to go. There's something about that. That to me is like the pleasure, you know, because like whatever I'm writing about, it's like something I want to know but don't want to know. I mean, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I'm always like examining something that I want to know but don't really want to know. So that's like, to me, kind of frightening, you know, but getting the sentences right. I mean, once I'm kind of in, you know, then I feel like I'm kind of getting close to the heart of it too. I mean, it all kind of comes together. I mean, I don't think I can totally separate, you know, the craft from the heart of the story. But it's true, when I talk to my students, I am so much more comfortable trying to talk about where was the heart of your story. I mean, I don't care whether you should start with this sentence or that sentence, or, you know, or like, well, maybe the beginning should be the end. I mean, you can't even talk about it until you know what the heart of the story is. Mm-hmm. I keep writing it, and then all of a sudden you kind of understand what the core is. And then like rearranging it, you know, kind of comes naturally.
But you have to write to find the core.
Right, exactly.
You can't know the core. You have to just, that activity gets you there.
Right. You have to like write and be willing to throw out what you wrote.
Right. And it's waiting and sitting for inspiration. That's never going to work.
Yeah.
It's interesting as I listen to you guys talk about, because I feel like I'm, you know, writing for stage is a little bit different. Because for me, becoming a writer was a true epiphany. I mean, it really was like, ooh, like a moment that just went like zing in my mind. And it was, I was in the School of Architecture because my dad was like, it's either medicine or law or engineering. He was an engineer, so it had to be one of those things. So we compromised was, why don't you study architecture? So I was studying architecture. I was miserable, and I was flying back to Turkey, and I had a stopover in New York City, and I saw a play, and it was called 5th of July by Lanford Wilson, and it blew me away. And then my mind just started going. And then when I got home one night, I sat down just simply with a pen and a pencil, and I just remember just putting that pencil on the pad, and I knew that this was what I had to do. And it was writing dialogue. And Pam, when you were talking about the 8-year-old, you know, the first book I ever read when I was about that age was Tom Sawyer. And I read it because it starts with dialogue. Like the first line is like a dialogue, piece of dialogue. So I feel like dialogue is really what made me a writer, just to communicate, because it's active and yeah. So I think that's why I asked that question, because for me it was really a moment of recognizing what it was. And I know some other people, but I also appreciate that, you know, for me it wasn't a process. It was just that moment was really the turning point for me, where everything started.
And you were in your 20s then, and had
Yeah, I was a sophomore in university.
So you never thought about being a writer?
I never thought about being a writer before then. No, I thought, you know, I was interested in film. I was sort of interested in theater, you know. But then that dialogue is really what made me realize that's what I had to do. So I can't write. I mean, I'm trying to write like a prose thing right now, and it's miserable. It's not my place, you know. I'm really pushing that thing, but dialogue just came naturally and easily.
Sinan, did you finish architecture school?
No. No. So after that summer, I returned to the University of Kansas, where I was studying architecture, and I wrote my parents a very long letter, and I said, "This is what I have decided. I'm leaving architecture. I'm going to study English and writing, and by the way, I'm also gay."
Yeah.
Pile it on, you know, like do the whole thing.
Yeah.
This was a time when letters took like 2 weeks to go across.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that's really good. That's sort of like, you know, like a doctor, you know, having to tell the patient really bad news and hitting him with a hammer first so that it doesn't goes by.
But then to have the news like flying there and you can't stop it anymore, but up in the air, I mean, that's so poignant.
Yeah.
But I was always drawn to description like Hester. I mean, I like, you know, like especially when I write fiction, I struggle with like creating dialogue. I mean, like in nonfiction, you know, some dialogue happen, you just have to kind of make it shorter, no problem, you know, but making up like exchange, conflict, that always like was hard for me. Whereas like that moment in which the puddle looks just right, or that
Absolutely.
something is put on the table and, you know, it's slightly skewed. I mean, that really interests me.
Me too. That's my favorite part of writing, is to describe something perfectly.
Yeah.
To get that.
I really admire that.
That's it. That's the great pleasure.
Me too.
We should do this more often.
This is
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
But so I just have a question for you all, because for me, like this idea of being a writer, I'm not quite sure what it means exactly even. I feel, because in some ways I feel like I'm two people. I'm the person who's, you know, washing the dishes, not frequently enough, according to Barbara, or walking the dog, or, you know, watching TV. And then there's the other person who is sitting at his desk. And it's almost like those are two different people. So often I have the experience of reading something I've written. I'll be picking up one of my books or something, and I have no memory of having written that. It's so, it's such an odd thing. I mean, I'm sort of surprised again, like, oh, you know, especially if I'm reading something that I like. And then I think, oh, did I do that?
That's pretty good. Yeah.
I don't know if you guys have that experience or not, but.
Yeah,
I remember maybe writing it.
I'm gonna leave the meeting, so give me like 5 minutes, okay? And I will be right there.
So I think we
Jane,
should
go
close
ahead.
this because it's going to be longer than we want to put on. But
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to go to
I do
address
think we should
this
do this.
problem downstairs.
Okay.
No, Kyoko, we're going to stop, I
We're
think.
stopping. So okay. This was fascinating, and
Yeah,
I think
I'm
we should
sorry.
do it again. And next time, somebody else come up with a couple of questions.
okay.
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 They were
Thank
good
you so much,
questions, Sinan.
everyone.
This is
Love
great.
you all. Okay.
Yeah.
Fun.